My name is John Weston. I am 38 years old, and I have always considered myself to be a man who stands firmly on his own 2 feet. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where the values of family and labor were an integral part of life. That's where I met Emily, the girl who one day became the meaning of my existence. She was everything I could have dreamed of: beautiful, smart, ambitious. We built a life together that I thought was solid and stable, but it all came crashing down in an instant. Have you ever considered that love can not only burn but also destroy? I never thought I would one day find myself in a position where the person I loved most in the world would be the source of my pain. Yet it happened. Emily changed. She began to drift away, as if our lives, our memories, our dreams no longer meant anything to her. This story is about how I faced a truth I was afraid to admit, about how love turned to emptiness and trust turned to betrayal. But it's also the story of how I learned to value myself and found freedom. I still remember the day everything started to fall apart. Emily came home late, her face a look of annoyance. She threw her bag on the couch and barely looked at me. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and waited for her. For the past few months, a wall had been growing between us, and I couldn't understand why. "Are you working late again?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She answered with a one-word yes and walked past me, not even stopping to talk. It had become a habit. We used to be able to spend hours discussing our day, laughing, planning our weekends. Now she was barely long enough for a few minutes of conversation. I couldn't figure out what went wrong. Maybe it was something I'd done myself. Maybe she was getting bored. These were the questions that plagued me. One evening, when I got my thoughts together, I decided to talk to her. "Emily, we have to talk. What's going on? It's like you're not here." She looked at me like I'd said something offensive. "What do you want to hear, John? That I'm tired? That I want space? You always think you can control me." Those words struck me. I never thought I was controlling her. Our marriage had always been based on mutual respect and trust. At least that's how it seemed to me. "Controlling? You're my wife. I just want to understand what's going on." "You don't own me, John. You have no right to dictate how I live my life." Those words sounded like a blow. I didn't dictate to her, but I suddenly realized that in her eyes I was someone trying to restrict her freedom. I went to bed with a heavy heart, and she stayed in the living room staring at her phone. The next day I began to notice little things that had previously escaped my attention. She started spending more time out of the house. There were calls she answered in a whisper. Her phone was always with her. She didn't leave it in plain sight like she used to. It all seemed strange, but I still wanted to believe it was just my imagination. A week later, I shared my worries with a friend, Mark. We'd known each other since high school, and I knew I could trust him. "John, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his eyes downcast. "But it's not what you want to hear." I froze. His voice was serious, and I sensed that he knew something important. "Speak up, Mark. I need to know." Mark sighed and said, "Emily is cheating on you, John, and I know that because it happened to me." It was like the world around me froze. His words echoed in my head, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you serious? Are you telling me that you're, with my wife?" "It was once, John. I swear it's over. She came to me after a fight with you. I was weak. I felt rage mixed with pain. How could he? How could she? And you kept quiet? How long were you going to hide it?" Mark explained that it was months ago, and he'd been trying to stay away ever since. But he felt he had to tell me the truth, so I knew what I was dealing with. I walked away from him without saying a word. I had confirmation now, but I still wanted to hear it from her. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was reeling with questions, scenes, images. And in the morning I prepared to set the record straight. Archive 1, video for YouTube, January 15th, 2025, 23:11. When Emily came down to the kitchen in the morning, I was already sitting there waiting for her. There was silence in the room, broken only by the muffled sound of the faucet dripping. She looked up at me, her face unfazed as if nothing had happened. "We need to talk, Emily," I began, trying to keep my cool. She raised an eyebrow, took the mug of coffee, and sat down across from me. "About what?" I felt my insides tighten. I didn't want to lose my temper, but the anger and resentment were too strong. I know you're cheating on me," I said, looking her straight in the eye. She froze for a moment, her hand halfway to her lips with the mug. But after a second, she got control of herself. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said calmly, as if it were a ridiculous thing to say. "Do you think I made it up?" I stood up, leaned on the table, and looked down at her. "I spoke to Mark. He told me everything." Her face went pale. She set the mug on the table so that the coffee spilled over the edge. "It's not true. He's lying." I sighed and shook my head slowly. "Don't lie to me, Emily. You know I deserve the truth." She got up from the table and started pacing the room. "It was a mistake, John. It didn't mean anything. It happened once." I felt something inside me break. Her confession, even a partial one, was like a knife to the heart. One time? Is that supposed to explain everything? Emily, how could you? She turned to me, her eyes filling with tears. I felt alone, John. You were so busy working, we drifted apart. It was a mistake. Lonely? Are you kidding me? I could barely contain my anger. You didn't try to talk to me, you just went and betrayed me. Emily lowered her head and I sensed that her words were just excuses. You ruined everything, Emily. Everything we'd built, everything I believed in. She looked up and there was something cold in her eyes. You never saw me suffer. You always thought only of yourself. Those words were the last straw. I felt my pain turn to rage. You want to know what I saw? I said, pulling my phone out of my pocket. I saw this. I opened the video Mark had given me and put the phone on the table in front of her. On the screen, she was with him, in his house, their faces too close to be explained by anything else. Emily turned even paler. She wanted to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. This is what you call nothing meant anything? I asked coldly. Is this what you call loneliness? She sat back down at the table, her hands shaking. I didn't know he'd written it down. You didn't know he recorded it? I repeated, feeling my emotions spiraling out of control. Is that all you have to say? She couldn't answer. Her silence said more than any words could. I thought I knew you, Emily. I thought you were an honest man. Her tears streamed down her cheeks, but I could no longer see them as a sign of regret. I don't own you, Emily, that's true. But now you are no longer my responsibility. I stood up, feeling like I couldn't stay in the same room with her anymore. I think you should start packing your things. Her eyes widened, and she stood up to say something, but I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there in complete silence. Archive 1 video for YouTube, the 15th of January, 2025, 23:12. When I returned to the kitchen, I saw that Emily was still sitting there the same way, not moving. The silence between us was so heavy I could almost feel it. I didn't know what to do next. I wanted to scream, to blame her for ruining everything we'd once dreamed of, but I knew that neither words nor actions would bring back the Emily I knew and loved. Are you going to pack your things or do you need me to help you? I said in a calm but firm tone, feeling the pain tearing at my insides. She looked at me, and there was something unimaginably tired on her face. I could see her lips quivering as she tried to say something, but all her words fell on deaf ears. I knew she realized it was over. It wasn't just a fight, it was the end of our life together. John, I don't know what to say. Her voice was shaky, but it wasn't the regret I expected. It was more fear than remorse. You don't have to say anything, Emily. You've already said everything. You've proven that our promises and our love mean nothing to you. I saw her eyes fill with tears, but I continued. You chose a different path, and I'm not going to stand in that way and wait for you to come back to me like nothing happened. I could see her body trembling slightly as she tried to pull herself together, but it didn't matter to me. The only question in my mind was, how could I not notice? How could I not see that she was cheating on me? How could I not realize she was with someone else when everything seemed perfect? These questions were tearing me apart, but I knew they wouldn't help. It didn't matter anymore. You're not kicking me out, John, she finally whispered, almost disbelieving her words. We can still talk. This isn't over. I looked at her, but in that moment I no longer saw her as my wife. This was the woman who had changed me. This was the woman who had betrayed my feelings, my hopes and dreams. I knew there was no going back for me. Do you want to talk? I whispered, an ominous chill in my voice. I did everything I could to keep our family together, to keep you happy, but you chose differently. You chose betrayal. You didn't just break my heart, you destroyed the whole life we were building. I don't want to be a part of it anymore. Despair appeared in her eyes. She stood up, taking a step in my direction, but I gestured for her to stay where she was. My words weren't threatening, but there was a determination in them that she didn't seem to expect. You've already made your choice, and now you need to take responsibility for it, I said, as if saying goodbye to what we once were. Pack your things. You're leaving. Tonight. I turned and walked away into the other room, not allowing myself to look back. I felt my heart break with pain, but at the same time I knew it was the only right decision. After a while I heard her start to pack her things. I couldn't stop her. I couldn't recreate the peace we had. This was the final phase, the phase of destruction that could not be undone. I heard her close the door as she left the house, and at that moment something inside me finally collapsed. But also something changed. I felt myself being freed from this heavy burden. It may have hurt, but I knew it was the end. And maybe it was the first step towards learning to live again. Archive 1 video for YouTube, The 15th of January, 2025, 23:13. The second part didn't start when I kicked Emily out of the house. No, it started much earlier, when I was ready to believe that she and I could get through anything. When I didn't notice her hidden signals and signs. Everything seemed normal. Everything was in place, like in movies where the hero doesn't notice what's going on around him for so long until the moment of truth comes. My morning became even emptier. I got up at 7 a.m. as usual, but now there wasn't the usual noise of Emily making breakfast. The place was too quiet without her. I walked toward the kitchen, and the first thing I saw was her empty chair, as a reminder that she wasn't here anymore. I knew she was gone, but it was hard for me to imagine it. I looked at the table, and then I noticed her photos. Family pictures taken on our summer vacations. Us on the beach, her smile, our eyes on the sunset, our hands intertwined in the shadows. It was all in the past. And now I sat alone at this table. All the memories, everything we'd experienced together seemed like a hoax. It was all a lie. I felt the irritation begin to build up inside of me. Strangely, instead of crying or suffering, I began to feel anger. It was part of a process I couldn't stop. I clenched inside. I wanted to pull this feeling, this pain out of me, but I had to do something. I started packing Emily's things. I went to her bedroom and opened the closet. All those dresses, the shoes she once wore, seemed foreign to me now. I could feel the resentment building up, and every dress she wore, every pair of shoes she wore, became symbols of her betrayal. I organized all of her things into piles, things I needed to throw away, things she could take with her, and things that seemed too personal for me to do anything with. I felt the heaviness of every step I took. My hands were full of her things, which seemed more than just things now. They had become part of someone else's life. Then I remembered her saying that she needed to be given space. But where was that space when she was choosing someone else? I found myself alone in our house with all her things as a heavy memory of something I had ignored for so long. When I finished packing up her things, I opened the door and put the boxes of her stuff right on the doorstep. It was easier than I thought it would be. I was surprised at how quickly I was able to get everything done. Maybe I was ready for it, though I hadn't realized how much. As the door closed behind her, I felt myself finding myself. My life was all mine now. Maybe Emily didn't realize I'd kicked her out for good. Maybe she thought things would go back to the way they always were. But it didn't. I stood at the window and watched her drive away. There was no more coming back. I felt a release. I could finally build my life anew. All the things I'd left behind now seemed part of another person, another life. And I was ready to move forward, even if it was difficult. Even if I had a long way to go to forget her, to forget what had happened. But in that moment, I was just alone. The anticipation of what would happen next was weighing on me. I didn't know what would happen, but I knew for sure that it would be my decision. I saw no point in going back. The story with Emily was over, and despite all the pain, I was ready to move on. That day when Emily left became something of a black void for me. When I woke up that morning, the house was the same as it had been before. The walls, the furniture, the windows that I'd always considered part of my world. But now, I was alone. Without her laughter, without her conversations, without her presence that had once been my comfort. I sat in this silence that pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. All I could do was wait, trying to figure out what to do next. My friends started calling. Igor, my best friend, called first. He was one of the people who had always supported me, but now his voice seemed distant. "How are you, brother? How is everything?" he asked, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "She's gone, Igor. I put her stuff out," I answered, feeling the pain come back. "It's over." It was all so unbelievable that I found it hard to believe what had happened. I knew that Emily had betrayed me. But how could she do that? How could she leave our family for another man? That feeling of emptiness and betrayal burned inside of me. That evening, I went to a bar to get my mind off things. The situation was too dire to stay home, and I felt like I just needed to get out, to meet people, if only for a little while. But at some point, sitting at a table at the bar, I realized that I couldn't hide from my feelings anymore. The whiskey wasn't helping. Thoughts of what had happened came back again and again. In that moment, I realized that I needed to free myself from it so I could finally move on. I walked out of the bar, not feeling relieved, but at least with some hint of resolution. I realized that I didn't want to live in the past anymore. I needed to let go of Emily and all of her mistakes. Back home, I looked again at the empty room where her clothes had once been, her belongings. Now there was nothing here. I didn't know what to do with what I had left behind, but I knew for sure it was needed. Freeing myself from the past started with small steps. I gathered all of her pictures and hid them. I didn't want to see them again until I was ready to figure out what I was going to do with those memories. In that moment, I realized I didn't want to live with the resentment anymore. Yes, she had betrayed me, but it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault for what she did. It wasn't my fault for what she did. I decided to put it all behind me. Those 2 days were a moment of change for me. I was able to look at my life from a different perspective. Life with Emily was a part of me, but now it was just a shadow. I wasn't going to continue to waste time with resentment. I decided to move on. This path wasn't an easy one, but I knew I had to move on. Even though the pain was intense, I could feel it slowly fading away as I regained control of myself. I began to live with the feeling that it was all necessary. It was necessary in order for me to become stronger. Maybe it wasn't fair, but life isn't always fair. All I had to do was accept it and move forward. I wasn't ready to be completely free of the pain right away, but I was ready to let myself move on. This chapter was complete. Though I was still haunted by the bitterness of betrayal, I knew it was time to let it go and start building my life again. Freeing myself from the past didn't happen overnight, but I realized it was time to stop holding on to the old. I now had to relearn how to live for myself and not to please others. It wasn't easy, but each day became a little clearer. It had been a few weeks since Emily had left. The house no longer seemed as empty as it had in the first few days. I began to find new rituals and habits. Every morning I would wake up and think that this day would be better than the last. Sometimes I had to fight myself because the memories of our past moments kept coming like shadows that I couldn't chase away. But I gradually began to realize that I didn't have to live in the past. One evening I met Igor. He was one of the few people who had supported me during this difficult period, and even though we had rarely spoken lately, I felt that his presence helped me move on. "How are you?" he asked, sitting down across from me in the cafe. I could see him looking at me carefully, trying to figure out how I was feeling. "I'm coping," I replied. It was hard, but I was beginning to realize that I could handle it. Igor nodded, as if he knew those weren't simple words. I could see how worried he was about me, and I was pleased that he wasn't trying to comfort me or pressure me. He was just there for me, like a trusted friend. "What's next?" he asked, waiting for me to continue. I hesitated. Honestly, I didn't know what to do next. I didn't want to be the kind of person who let himself cling to memories and pain anymore. I felt like I needed to take a step forward, but I didn't know where to go yet. "I think I need to focus on myself," I said, "to become a better person, to figure myself out. I don't want to be tied to this pain forever." Igor nodded with understanding. I knew I still had a lot of work to do to completely free myself from the past, but I was ready. I needed to find a path that would lead me to inner peace. When I returned home, I continued to work on myself. I started attending workouts, going to the gym because I felt it would help me not only physically, but mentally as well. I focused on growing, on getting better, not just worrying. Every day I could feel myself taking back control of my life. A few months passed and life began to change. I met a few new people, made new acquaintances, and although I wasn't ready for a new relationship yet, I felt like I was slowly finding myself. I became more confident, more motivated. Everything that had happened before had been a lesson to me, and I didn't want to stay in the past. But one day when I was coming home, I found a letter. It was on the table, and when I saw it, I immediately realized who might have left it. It was Emily. I didn't know what she wanted to say, but when I opened the envelope, I read her letter. "I didn't expect you to be able to let me go like this. I'm so sorry it turned out this way. I realized that I was losing the most important thing in my life. I hope you will forgive me someday. I want to go back and start over if you give me the chance. Please think about it." I sat there holding the letter in my hands. On one hand, I felt that her words were an attempt to bring me back to the life I had already let go of. On the other hand, I realized I didn't want to live in her shadow, in what was between us. I had been through the pain, and I was no longer the kind of person who was willing to put up with betrayal. I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer. I was no longer someone who would go back. I had already learned to let go. I already knew that I needed to move forward, not backward. And even though this moment was difficult, I knew it was the right choice. The third act of my life was just beginning, and I was ready to face it without fear and with an open heart, because now I knew that my life was my choice. A few more months passed. I continued to work on myself, and I grew stronger every day. I learned to find joy in the simple things: a walk in the fresh air, a morning cup of coffee, talking with friends, meeting new people. Life wasn't perfect, but I finally learned to live without the constant heavy burden on my soul. Sometimes, of course, there were moments when I felt the shadow of past mistakes, but I no longer let those memories dictate my life. I reevaluated my priorities and found new meaning and purpose. I focused on career growth, on making my life better. I became more independent, more determined. And then, after a long time, I realized that I was no longer thinking about what had happened with Emily. I didn't need to waste any more time on regrets or resentment. One day, a year after she left, I found myself at a reunion of old friends. We were talking about the old days, how things were once different, how we were all going through our struggles. And then, in the midst of all this talk, a thought suddenly occurred to me. I had won. I wasn't destroyed like I was when Emily left. I was able to find the strength not just to survive, but to become a better person. My life took a whole new path. I met other people, I continued to grow and develop, but most importantly, I learned to value myself. I was no longer dependent on someone else to support me or determine my happiness. It was a personal accomplishment that meant the most to me. A few more years passed. I didn't see Emily, and her shadow no longer plagued me. I found peace within myself again, was able to love, but no longer without fear, no longer attached to the painful experiences she had left behind. I had found my way, and that was the most important thing. The story with Emily was behind me. I learned to forgive, not her, but myself. Because sometimes to move forward, you have to forgive yourself first. And it was only when I learned to let go of the past that I realized I was capable of happiness again. Now that I think about it, I realize that that painful experience made me who I am. It taught me to be stronger, wiser, and more confident. And maybe that is the true strength, not to hold on to the pain, but to let it go and allow myself to move on. I don't hold a grudge against her anymore, and I don't need her forgiveness. I forgive myself, and that is enough. Because I am a better person, and that was my choice. I know now that there is only a new beginning ahead.